Hi crafty friends! I wanted to take a few minutes today to talk to you about my favorite new die cut release from Tim Holtz and Sizzix Alterations, and that's this planks die. It's a steel roll die cut, and amazingly they were able to get all of this detail on the sides of the different planks with a steel roll die, and so I'm really amazed by that. Now, usually when we are cutting something like a wood plank shape, we want it to have wood grain in it. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how to get a wood grain look with some different mediums. One of the first ones that I'm going to use is the Distress Mixed Media Heavy Stock. I use this for several different techniques, but one of the first ones I wanted to talk about is a technique that Tim taught us in, I think it was one of his techniques for maybe one of the tags or something like that. But that's this faux wood grain using paint and ink. For this one, I just wanted it to look like weathered wood, like from the seashore or something like that. And so I used the grays, the hickory smoke paint and hickory smoke stain. But if you wanted it to look like maybe it had been painted wood planks, you might want to use a colored paint and then maybe a brown or a gray stain to finish it out. But this is how you do this technique. I like to use the jabber tops, but you could use a dry brush method to do the same thing. What you want to do is that you want to put paint on just in kind of random stripes all going the same direction, and that's going to give you kind of this grain effect. And then you're going to fill in with either a distress ink, or you could use the distress stain because it goes on much quicker. Now, once the paint has dried and then you apply the ink, then you can take a very lightly dampened cloth and you just wipe it off, very lightly dampened, and that's going to take any excess ink off of the top of the paint because the paint will resist the ink, and then you'll have this faux wood grain. If you're using a color and you're using maybe a brown or a gray stain, you really definitely want to do that technique because you want to be able to see the paint color through. But I think that's just a really quick, easy, fun wood grain, faux wood grain technique from Tim from one of his demos in the past. Now, another thing that you can do is that most of us have just regular cardstock that we're going to use, and we're going to run it through our die. Now, this is, like I said, regular cardstock, and when you run it through, you can see that it has the edges, but it doesn't have much of a wood grain to it. You can take a sanding block or something like that, run over it all in the same direction, take away some of that top color, allowing the middle core to show through, and then ink around the edges, and you'll get something that looks a little bit more like another faux wood grain technique. So that's just with cardstock. If you are a fan of Tim's dies from Sizzix, you may also be a fan of his texture fades, and so this is one of the older texture fades. This is the wood grain texture fade, and I know he has a new one coming out that is 3D, and it's going to be awesome. I'm absolutely sure. I can't wait to get my hands on it when it does come out, just so that I can cut a bunch of planks that I've run through the 3D texture fade. But this one works perfectly fine as it is. So as I said, this is an older die, and what I did was I ran some colored cardstock through it. Now, this colored cardstock, however, does have a craft core to it. So if you run a colored cardstock through the texture fade, then what I did was I actually sanded it before I cut it out with the planks. I sanded it down and I inked it so that I could see all of that beautiful texture, and it kind of looks like the wood has worn away from the raised areas of the grain. So that's another technique you can use using a texture fade and just regular cardstock. Now, you may also be a fan of Tim's other companies that he designs with, and that might be Stampers Anonymous. And as you know, Stampers Anonymous makes not only stamps, but they also make these wonderful stencils, and they make them in two sizes. So this is stencil number 23, THS 23, and then THMS for the mini 23. And all I did was just the regular stencil technique. I put it right over some heavy stock, and I put my distress ink through it, and then I went over and I colored in between with the Distress ink again. And I believe this is brushed corduroy. I love that golden color that you get with the brushed corduroy. So this just kind of looks maybe like some unstained pine. And that's the grain that you would get with just a stencil. Okay, talking again about the stamps with Stampers Anonymous. Tim has at least 3 wood grain stamps that I'm going to show you today. And this is an older one. This is CMS 126. This is wallpaper and wood. I really like this wood grain stamp because there's so many close textures to this. It just looks like you could almost feel it. Now there's a problem when you're stamping with a background stamp in that you need to go, of course, with the ink pad to the background stamp. And I like to do this technique when I'm stamping the wood grain. I like to stamp the grain with archival ink. Most of us have the Distress archival inks in something like this. And it's really difficult to get these little, they don't come out. And so it's difficult to ink up a large background stamp with one of the small pads. But that's okay, because again, with a tip from Tim, you can order from Ranger or your online store, or if you have a local hobby store that will order for you, you can get the DIY Distress Ink Custom Blend pads. These pads are the same felt that all of your Distress and Oxide inks come in, and then all you have to do is, when you get these, also get the archival re-inkers that would re-ink the previous pad that I showed you that have all 4 of them on there. But if you just use one color per pad, now you have your standalone ink pad that you can ink up the whole background stamp with archival ink. So I've done that for each one of the colors, the Vintage Photo and the Hickory Smoke and the Black Soot. So I really recommend that you do that if you're going to be using large background stamps with archival ink, Distress Archival. Now this one I used the ground espresso. I stamped it and then I went over it with Distress ink and ground espresso to color it in so that it looks like dark stained pine. This is another one that has actually 2 wood grain stamps on it. This is the Birch and Pine set. It's CMS 280, and as you can see, I have done the birch up here, and then this is the pine down here, and I did this in the Hickory Smoke, and this is in the Vintage Photo with a little bit of the picket fence to kind of bring the bright Vintage Photo down. I covered it with some of the picket fence. So those are 3 stamps you can use to make your own wood grain to then cut out. And of course the base for all of those is that mixed media heavy stock. I use this for all my stamping almost. Now, because this is steel wool, you can cut other things with it. You can cut chipboard, you can cut burlap, you can cut fabric, you can cut felt, foam, all kinds of things. One of the fun things that you can actually cut with it is real wood. So this is birch plywood, and you can find this in any hobby store like Michael's or Hobby Lobby or one of those, and go to the wood section and you can usually find these. This one was 6 inches by 12 inches and it's 0.44 millimeters. It's just a tiny bit thicker than a piece of like cardstock or something like that. So it's not really thick wood, but because it is wood, you can already see the grain in it before I even cut it. And so I ran it through my die cut, and look at that. All of that beautiful wood grain, and all I had to do was add a little bit of Distress ink onto that, and it just pulls out that wood grain beautifully, and you can even see it has kind of a little sheen to it. So that is a fabulous thing to do with a steel rule die, is to use something other than just paper in it, which is so much fun. All right, now to my most favorite thing to use with this particular die cut, and that is the Distress wood grain cardstock. This cardstock is already raised and already has a wood grain to it. There's a texture to it already, and all you have to do is ink it. And so I've used oxides and Distress inks on this to make that wood grain stand out, and then I would just use it to cut the planks out of the the distressed wood grain cardstock once I've colored it. You don't have to use browns on it. You can actually use colors, which is kind of fun. If you look at some of my samples below, like the one I did for the kind of a Caribbean boardwalk look, you can see that I used some blues and some yellows and pinks. So use some of the different colors also to just kind of make it look like fun painted wood that you would be using on something. Now I have used these planks for things like a sign. I'm going to be using this for a Disney Scrappers challenge that's coming up on the Disney Scrappers site. I'm going to use this for a Tiki Room scrapbook page. But you can see that I used that wood grain cardstock not just to cut out the plank, but also to cut out the lower cutout alpha that's a new release from Tim also. And I just used the peacock oxide to color those letters. Now I wanted to show you what I did, because last fall I made some cards with planks and I didn't have this wonderful die, and so they lacked the character that this die brings to wood planks. So you might remember that I did this pirate card, and so I kind of hand cut out some planks out of the distressed wood grain cardstock. But how much better would it be to have something with a little character over it, okay, and then cut it out? And so much easier to just run it through the die cut and then to put your stamp on top of it. So much easier. Another one that I did, you might remember this one, and I made this kind of tabletop out of just some of the strips of the die. Well, what I did was that I took and I colored my wood grain and I cut it out of all the same size, and then I cut it. Okay, so I cut the planks and then I put them together in different ways to form the table. So you can see here, and this is not detailed, it's a fairly simple card, but you can see that I made the table and it has all of those great edges and the little grooves and everything in it to make it look like a really weathered, worn table. Look how much detail is in that with the planks versus just cutting it into those strips. So another really, really cool way to layer them together. And don't be afraid to cut them and then to put the different ends together as you're using it. Now here's another card that I made just cutting some planks. It's okay, it's fine. But look how cool. I used this, and one of these, and look at how much character it gave the card as opposed to this. So much fun to use these planks with that wood grain cardstock, and look at just how much character it gives in light of that. Okay, and there's one other thing that I did, and that was that I took and I colored the wood grain cardstock, but I used a lighter color ink for this technique, and I wanted to do something different with it. And so I saw on Pinterest that some people had put, I don't know if it was paper or if they had painted it, but there were some beautiful florals that were on some wood planks. And so I used that for inspiration, and I took some of the yellow roses from the collage paper, and I used my Distress Collage medium, and I collaged it onto a whole, you'll see the steps below this video, but I collaged it onto a whole sheet of the stained wood grain cardstock. And once I had put it on there and I had dried it, then I took and I sanded the paper. I went in circular motion. I sanded off some of that collage paper so that it would reveal some of that wood grain through the collage paper, and it would wear some of it away and tear some of it away. And I just really love how that rusticness turned out and how it just kind of pulled down all of the colors in that. And then I took the piece, I cut it into strips, and I cut all the same size strip for the planks so that you could see the pattern once I put them all back on in order. And so here's just a really simple card using the planks and the collage medium that I did from some Pinterest inspiration. So those are just a few things that I've done with the planks die, and I have pictures of all of them and any of the samples that I've done so far that are below.